The fact that a small group of technocrats could shut down the global economic system is absolutely amazing. While we're just coming out of the lockdown in America, we now have another catastrophe that's beset us, namely the nationwide riots and protests that are taking place. But it's interesting to note that both the Great Panic of 2020 and the Great Protest of 2020 both have common roots, in two ways at least. Number one, the same people seem to be sponsoring both instances. Secondly, they started over some very small and minor issue by comparison and blew into something completely disproportionate to their origins. In the case of the Great Panic of 2020, we had a virus that broke out in China. Before it even hit the continent of North America or Europe, computer modelers were already working overtime to suggest that millions of people were going to die and that the only way to stop it was to do what they said to do. The policies they threw out, oddly enough, things like social distancing, things like wearing face masks, things like lockdown of the economy, things like shutting down schools from top to bottom. All of these policies came out of this same crowd that proposed the panic in the first place. These were technocrats. These were people who were committed to the United Nations. They're committed to sustainable development, which has had a beef with capitalism and free enterprise for decades. The United Nations has sworn to overthrow capitalism and free enterprise. So the people that started the pandemic were a clique of technocrats who had a vested interest in shutting down the global economy. Well, what happened? The global economy got shut down. You have the same type of thing now happening with these protests in America. Just as we're starting to pull out of it, all of a sudden, we're shutting down again. People are running around in just abject fear that the violence is going to come to their neighborhood, to their store, to their storefront, to their communities, to the suburbs. And they're sworn to come to the suburbs as well. The people that are backing groups like Antifa, that is the anti-fascist organization, which is primarily Marxist-oriented, groups like this are being sponsored by certain global elite interests like George Soros, who's been documented to have funded some of these organizations, and they're acting in concert at the same time across the country and even across the world now to accomplish a societal breakdown. They're trying to rip the fabric of our country apart while we're still busy sorting out the economic fallout from the Great Lockdown, the Great Panic of 2020 over the pandemic. Censorship is running rampant. Big tech companies like Facebook and Twitter, Google, are all acting in concert to shut down free speech. So I'm not sure at this point how America is going to tackle this problem. But I do know that Americans are resourceful. We have a new type of enemy. It's not an enemy with battle tanks. It's not an enemy necessarily with airplanes and missiles and ICBMs, but it's an enemy with an algorithm. It's an enemy who believes that only science can determine what is really true in the world. All other views are excluded, including Judeo-Christian ethics, biblical worldviews, etc., are all excluded from the discussion as being ridiculous. I believe very firmly, based on my entire study of technocracy and economic issues dating back to the early 1970s, that technocracy is engaged right this minute in a coup d'etat that will attempt to conquer the entire planet for the sake of establishing a technocracy. I don't think there's any doubt about it anymore. Anybody who has the power to shut down the global economic system in the first place has something going for them, you have to admit. Not everybody could do that. President Trump couldn't do that if he wanted to. In fact, there's no group of leaders in the world that could, political leaders at least, that could cause such a thing to happen. But the technocrats did. And now, just as we're getting used to the idea that our economic system has been ripped apart, ripped to shreds in America, with unemployment now approaching that of the Great Depression, in some pockets even greater than the Great Depression, these two events are coordinated very carefully. That is, the pandemic and these protests across America. And you say, how do I know that? Look at the funding. Where is the money coming from? These people across the country don't have funds to launch a nationwide protest. Antifa does not have the type of funds just somehow by membership dues or something, or going around neighborhoods collecting $2 donations. You can't launch a nationwide protest on that kind of money. Institutional money has entered the scene. And we know for a fact, it's been documented now, for instance, that George Soros has contributed to groups like Antifa to fund protests, leftist protests, Marxist protests around the country to cause destruction and the breakdown of American society. This is a fact. And we can see this money pouring in just looking at the tens of thousands of people now who are rioting across America and tearing everything apart. We see this now as nothing more than an extension of the technocratic coup d'etat that started with the Great Panic of 2020 and the pandemic, and that now, phase two, is fully implemented to destroy the social fabric of America. In order to make my point here again, I'll go back to one of the original architects of technocracy, Thorstein Veblen, way back in roughly 1922, 1925. He said that technocracy, that's the era that we're in now, would naturally supersede the Marxist, socialist, communist paradigm. He viewed those as necessary stepping stones to get to the end goal, which was technocracy. Zbigniew Brzezinski came along in 1970 while he was a professor at Columbia University and said exactly the same thing in his book, Between Two Ages, America's Role in the Technotronic Era. He concluded that Marxism was a necessary stepping stone to his technotronic era, which is technocracy. They fed this subsequently to the United Nations, by the way, and it became sustainable development or green economy or Green New Deal. There's a number of terms now that describe it. But the whole concept of technocracy was then fed to the United Nations, which took it to the world. And now the world is thoroughly engulfed in this sustainable development mantra. But it requires the death of capitalism and free enterprise to implement. So who's outgunning for capitalism and free enterprise? Well, it's the technocrats. They're the ones that have pulled the strings to get us this far. They're the ones that are standing behind with financing, with moral support, with resources to fan the flames of the civil unrest that we have in our nation today. This is not a Marxist takeover of our nation, my friends. Don't even go there. Don't even think it, because that is not the case. The Marxists have become the useful idiots of the technocrats. They don't have a clue that they're going to be the first ones that get thrown under the bus when technocracy gains complete control of the global system. They don't see this. They don't see the hand above them manipulating them. They don't see who's executing and creating the policies to be executed all around the world. They're blind to it. But they're the ones that are going to be the first destroyed if technocracy wins completely and takes over. This is not a communist revolution in America. It is designed, however, and being used by those technocrats to tear our country apart. It's the great destroyer. It's the great deconstructor of society in America. That's all. Nothing more. And if these elements are successful, and at this point, who knows, they could be, maybe not, but if they're successful, when the ashes and the cars and everything else are still smoldering, out of those disasters, technocrats will rise. People will beg even for technocrats to come in and restore order to society. We've seen this happen in many countries around the world in the last 20 years. These technocrats will gladly at that point come in and say, well, it took you long enough to ask us, didn't it? So you see where this is headed? Technocracy right now has a vice grip on the entire planet.